Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
I pulled into the driveway like I was breaking a promise I'd made to myself a long time ago, not to come back unless I had something to show for the years I'd been gone. The house looked smaller than I remembered, though the tulips Mom had planted decades ago still came up every spring like they didn't care how many family arguments they'd heard through the kitchen window. The porch light was on even though it was daylight, and that detail hit me harder than I expected, because Mom used to say the porch light stayed on for family, no matter what. The screen door creaked like it remembered me. I walked into a house that smelled like ham, honey, and a little bit of dust, the kind that sticks to picture frames no one dares to clean because they might shake loose old ghosts. My father was exactly where I thought he'd be, leaning over the counter, glass of bourbon in hand even though it was barely 4, talking low to Grandma June, who was shelling deviled eggs with a precision that bordered on surgical. She looked up, and her face lit up like someone turned the damn clock back 20 years. "There's my girl," she said, setting down the egg with care and wiping her hands on her apron like she was about to hug royalty. Jake was already at the dining table, legs spread wide, glass of red wine in one hand, and that stupid condescending smirk on his face that always made me want to shove something sharp into the wood paneling. "Well, well, look who remembered we exist," he said, raising his glass like I'd just walked into a roast. "Still doing that silly little startup thing, huh?" Right then and there, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt. It was like watching a mosquito land on your arm. You don't panic, you just wait for the right moment to slap the bastard. I smiled, slowly, and walked past him like I didn't even hear it. I hugged Grandma, kissed Mom's cheek, nodded at Dad, who gave me one of those nods back that meant nothing and everything. Claire was there too, next to Jake. Her smile stiff as frozen butter. She looked uncomfortable in her skin, like maybe Easter wasn't sitting right with her this year. Has anyone ever underestimated you so badly they didn't realize you were holding the dagger and the contract? That's the question I keep asking myself when I think about that moment. Because while Jake laughed, what none of them knew, not even Grandma, not yet, was that Bright Nest, my silly little startup, had been in closed negotiations for the past 4 months, and that just 2 days before Easter, the deal had finalized. My company, quietly and legally, had acquired controlling interest in FleetCap. Jake's company, the very thing he had spent 15 years building with our father's blessing, his wife's support, and the kind of money you only get when your name carries more weight than your pitch. I had bought it, clean, silent, final. But I didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, I took my seat at the table, sandwiched between Grandma and Claire, who still hadn't looked me in the eye. The table was set with all the usual suspects: glazed carrots, mashed potatoes, the good china. Grandma still believed holidays were sacred, even if half the people around her would rather be anywhere else. Dinner conversation was awkward in the way it always is when no one wants to be the first one to say what they're actually thinking. Dad brought up gas prices like it was world politics. Mom kept fussing with the rolls. Jake talked about supply chains and how his company had survived COVID better than most, while Claire chimed in now and then like a well-trained parrot. No one asked me about Bright Nest. No one asked me anything, really, which was fine. I liked the silence. I'd earned it. It wasn't until the ham was being sliced that Grandma turned to me, casually, like she was asking about the weather, and said, "Is that the same startup that just acquired Jake's company?" The room went silent so fast I could hear the tick of the kitchen clock over the stove. Mom's hand froze mid-pour. Claire's fork clinked against her plate. Jake didn't move, but his face went pale in that ugly, blotchy way that men get when their blood pressure hits the ceiling and they realize they're not in control anymore. I didn't say a word. I just reached for a roll, broke it open, and smiled. You see, Grandma's old, not stupid. And she's got a cousin who still reads financial papers cover to cover. She knew. She'd known for days, but the timing, oh, that was hers. Her gift to me. Jake tried to laugh it off, but it was too late. The air had changed, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt like I had weight in that house. Not because I'd won, but because I'd waited. Patiently, quietly, and when the moment came, I didn't need to shout. I just needed to let silence do the talking, and that was just the beginning. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come with yelling or slammed doors, the kind that doesn't leave bruises or broken glass in its wake, and yet it carves through your sense of self like a rusted blade, dull and cruel, lingering in the bloodstream long after the wound is made. And for me, that betrayal had a name, a face, and the sort of smile that used to make me believe I wasn't alone in the fight to build something that mattered. Her name was Claire, and for 5 years she had been more than a business partner. She had been my ally, my confidant, the person who stayed late to finish pitch decks and reminded me to eat when I forgot that time existed, who cheered when our first round of seed funding came through and cried with me when we got sued by that bastard from Austin who thought we'd borrowed his interface, even though we'd built it from scratch on caffeine, spite, and borrowed laptops. We weren't friends. We were something beyond that, something harder to name and even harder to lose. And when I found out she was sleeping with Jake, my older brother who never missed a chance to belittle me in front of anyone who'd listen, it wasn't just the personal sting that got me. It was the timing, the absolute surgical precision of her betrayal. It had been 3 weeks since our biggest investor pulled out over internal disagreements, which, looking back, might have had something to do with the quiet meetings Claire had been having that she'd brushed off as networking dinners. I hadn't connected the dots yet, not then, because I still believed that Claire was too invested, too embedded in the vision of Brightnest, too loyal to leave, until the morning she walked into my apartment, her face unreadable, and said, "I think I need to move on." I thought it was burnout. I thought she was tired, or sick, or maybe heartbroken in the way all founders get when they hit the wall at full speed. I asked if she needed a break. I asked if she wanted equity. I asked all the wrong questions because the only one I didn't ask was whether she was already working with my brother. I found out 2 days later, through LinkedIn of all places, that Claire had joined FleetCap as Strategic Growth Officer, which was corporate speak for she just replaced the guy Jake forced into early retirement. I stared at that post for nearly 5 minutes, not blinking, my thumb frozen on the screen, because in that moment, the betrayal became total. It wasn't just that she left me. It was that she went to him. She didn't just leave the table. We'd built the damn table together. And she took my blueprints and set up shop in my brother's house, like that was the plan all along. And then, because the universe has a sense of humor darker than mine, they got engaged. Publicly. In a goddamn press release. FleetCap CEO announces engagement to company's new growth officer as part of a broader strategy to bring innovation to the logistics space. The headline read, and I swear I could hear Jake's smug voice in every word. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even throw my phone across the room like I wanted to. I just sat there on my old couch with the broken middle spring, staring at the wall, trying to figure out when exactly I became the kind of person people thought they could walk over without consequence. The next day I started making calls, not to friends, not to therapists, not to lawyers. I called my mentor, Maxine, the woman who once ran a venture firm so ruthless it had a nickname among founders, the Widowmaker. Maxine had retired years ago, but she still had strings she could pull and people who owed her favors that came with compound interest. I didn't need money. I didn't need revenge. Not yet. I needed leverage. I needed to know how Jake's company was really doing. Because for all his big talk, Jake had one weakness that never changed. He treated logistics like a family farm, not a business built on moving targets. He thought the same model that worked in 2008 would carry him into the next decade. He was wrong. Within a week, I had more than enough data to confirm what I already suspected. FleetCap was bloated, overspent, and hemorrhaging operational costs on outdated contracts and loyalty-based vendors Jake refused to cut. Their tech infrastructure was laughable. Their client retention was starting to slip, slowly but steadily, and in a few key regions, their growth had flatlined completely. All it would take was the right kind of disruption, a quiet, focused takeover that didn't look like an attack until the paperwork was already filed. That's when the idea started to crystallize. I wasn't going to fight for respect anymore. I wasn't going to beg people like Claire to believe in me, or wait for my father to see value in what I'd built, just because he thought logistics was real work, and software was for people who couldn't do anything with their hands. I wasn't going to prove myself. I was going to build something that made proving myself irrelevant. But first, I had to disappear. Not from the world, but from their radar. I renamed my startup, rebranded the pitch, created a shell company to keep the investors clean, started hiring people who didn't know Claire, who didn't know Jake, who didn't care about the family drama behind the curtain. And as I started building again, brick by brick, I made a quiet promise to myself. The next time I walked into a room with my brother, he wouldn't see me as a joke. He wouldn't see me coming at all. And that's when I found the crack in the wall. An obscure filing in Delaware that revealed something Jake had tried to keep quiet. A loan, a large one, with terms that left FleetCap dangerously exposed if certain conditions were met. Conditions that I, with the right strategy and timing, could help trigger. I saved the document, highlighted the relevant sections, and created a folder titled simply Endgame. Because this wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity. This was about building an empire out of the pieces they left behind. There's something uniquely isolating about rebuilding from rubble you didn't expect to fall, especially when the demolition crew was made up of people who once stood shoulder to shoulder with you, people who once toasted your victories and spoke about vision and legacy like they believed in every syllable. And yet, in the wake of Claire's betrayal and Jake's smug takeover of my past, I found that isolation became my armor. A quiet clarity that stripped away the noise and left only the work, the long hours, and the kind of focus that doesn't ask for applause or company. Rebuilding wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was slow, meticulous, intentional, the kind of grind most people give up on long before the results start to matter. But I had time, I had fury, and for the first time in my life, I had no desire to be seen, only to be underestimated. I called it Nestcore, a name no one would link to Brightnest unless they were obsessively following the tech directories, which no one was. I made sure the website looked generic, bland even, with vague language about systems architecture and operational efficiencies that meant everything and nothing. It was camouflage, and I wore it well. My cap table was clean. No founders, no familiar names, no ghosts from the past. I knew better this time. No best friends, no family, no partners who doubled as drinking buddies, just mercenaries. Smart, hungry, ambitious people who didn't care about loyalty or history, only the upside. I brought in Andrei, a quietly brilliant Romanian engineer who'd been fired from a logistics firm for being too difficult to manage, which translated, as far as I could tell, to didn't nod when the CEO spoke nonsense. I paired him with Janelle, a ruthless financial analyst from New York who once told me over coffee that her dream job was to dismantle inefficient corporations like Legos and sell the parts for scrap. We didn't have a mission statement. We had a target. And that target was FleetCap. But taking down my brother's company wasn't going to be about ego or public revenge. That kind of visible grudge would tip my hand. And besides, Jake thrived on confrontation. He loved the attention, loved the narrative of being attacked, because it gave him a chance to posture and perform. No, my strategy had to be surgical, quiet, and wrapped in plausible deniability. We weren't going to attack from the front. We were going to buy up the floor he was standing on, plank by plank, until there was nothing left beneath his boots. FleetCap relied on a tangled web of vendors, third-party drivers, and regional contractors to stay afloat. It had grown too fast, too wide, and Jake had built it with the assumption that relationships mattered more than margins. That might have worked when the economy was stable and gas was cheap. But in the current climate, loyalty didn't pay bills. Efficiency did. Nestcore began approaching those same contractors, not with bold offers or flashy pitches, but with quiet conversations, better payment terms, and software tools that actually made their lives easier. We weren't the loudest option. We were the cleanest. Within 9 months, we had absorbed 16 of FleetCap's mid-level regional partners, 4 of their preferred maintenance service providers, and the exclusive software rights to a routing tool they'd been using for 5 years, all through shell entities and whispered deals that Jake never saw coming. I watched his quarterly reports with the detached amusement of someone observing a house leak from the attic, knowing the owner was still obsessing over the windows. The final play came when I found out that FleetCap's East Coast operations were being managed by a subcontractor with a nasty history of financial mismanagement, something Jake either didn't know or had chosen to ignore. Nestcore acquired the subcontractor's parent company, quietly cleaned house, and by doing so, inherited the right to renegotiate all East Coast logistics contracts, which meant that effectively, we could cut FleetCap out of its own delivery network by simply adjusting a few contract clauses and fees. It was an elegant dismantling, quiet, professional, and fully legal. And still, I didn't show my face. Not once did I attend a meeting under my real name. Not once did I sign a contract directly. I worked through proxies, partners, and people who owed me nothing except the incentive to win. I wanted Jake to feel the pressure without ever understanding its source. I wanted Claire to sit in those FleetCap meetings and wonder why the numbers kept slipping, why their projections were missing targets, why their investor calls were turning colder. I wanted her to feel the ground shifting without knowing that I was the one pulling it out from under her. By the 12th month, Nestcore was no longer a startup. It was a competitor. And when our offer came through to acquire a controlling stake in FleetCap, delivered by a private equity firm we'd strategically partnered with, Jake accepted, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The numbers were bleeding red, his board was panicking, and the offer looked like salvation wrapped in a golden parachute. He had no idea that the woman behind the offer was his little sister, the one he laughed at, the one he mocked at every family gathering, the one whose silly little startup had just become the majority stakeholder in his life's work. When the final documents were signed and the acquisition completed, I stared at my screen for a long time. Just the words "transaction confirmed," glowing in green, quiet and unassuming. And I didn't feel victorious. Not yet, because this wasn't the moment I wanted. This wasn't the part they'd remember. That would come later. That would come at the dinner table, with wine, with ham, with silence so thick it could choke a room. That moment would be mine. And it was coming. There is a particular kind of anticipation that coils itself quietly around your spine when you know something monumental is about to shift. But everyone around you is still playing their roles, oblivious to the fact that the script has already changed, and that they are walking straight into a scene they didn't know they were in. That was the tension that simmered beneath my skin as I stood in my childhood kitchen on Easter Sunday, watching my mother frantically baste a ham that didn't need more basting, listening to my father ramble about gas prices and real industries as though the world still operated by the rules of 1982, and pretending not to notice the way Claire's hand trembled just slightly every time she adjusted her engagement ring. The dining room was dressed like it always had been. Too much lace, crystal glasses that only saw daylight twice a year, and a centerpiece of fake tulips that had somehow survived 20 springs in a drawer. Everything looked the same, which made it almost laughable, because nothing was the same. Jake, of course, was already halfway through his second glass of wine before anyone had even touched their plates, leaning back in his chair with that unbearable posture he'd picked up over the years. Shoulders wide, neck stiff. The physical manifestation of someone who believed he had nothing left to prove. He made idle conversation with Dad, talking about market shifts and expanding the freight lanes, never once acknowledging the brutal quarter he'd just closed, the one that hinted at collapse, the one I had orchestrated with a scalpel instead of a hammer. And still he carried himself like the king of this castle, tossing little barbs my way, as though he were still the big brother who'd won the science fair and the family name in one stroke. "So," he finally said, during a lull that hovered over the table like a sneeze that wouldn't come, "you still doing that silly little startup thing, huh?" It was so expected, so painfully routine, that for a moment I wondered if he even believed it anymore, or if he was just performing the lines he'd memorized long ago, hoping the same script would still keep him center stage. I could feel my fingers tighten slightly on my fork, but I didn't look at him. I looked at the glazed carrots, the kind Grandma used to make before her arthritis made slicing too painful. I smiled. I didn't need to speak. Not yet. Because the moment wasn't mine to initiate. That belonged to Grandma June. She had been quiet through most of dinner, picking at her food, watching the room with those small, sharp eyes of hers. The ones that never missed a thing, no matter how much bourbon was in her teacup. She waited deliberately, and only once the silence after Jake's jab had stretched long enough to settle like dust did she turn toward me, her voice deceptively gentle, and ask, "Is that the same startup that just acquired his company?" It didn't hit all at once. Not like in the movies. There wasn't a gasp or a dramatic drop of silverware. What there was instead was an unraveling, a slow, horrifying unraveling of posture and certainty, starting with Jake's jaw tightening just a second too late, and Claire's fork pausing in midair as her eyes flicked from me to Jake and back again, searching for some cue that would tell her what the hell was happening. My father blinked, then frowned, as if trying to figure out whether he had misheard or whether someone had just rewritten the family hierarchy in one sentence. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger on the train who suddenly starts speaking your name. I didn't say a word, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew silence would carry the weight more effectively than any speech. I reached calmly for a roll, tore it open, let the steam rise, and spread butter with the same deliberate slowness Grandma had used on those eggs in the kitchen just hours before. I didn't look at Jake. I didn't need to, because I could feel him unraveling next to me, piece by piece, realization colliding with pride, disbelief melting into dread, the sheer impossibility of what he was hearing, battling against the tiny, irrepressible fear that it might actually be true. Claire was the first to break. "Wait," she said too loudly, her voice tight. "What is she talking about?" She looked at Jake, then at me, as if we'd conspired to play a joke on her, and I could see it. See the moment her confidence cracked. See the ugly suspicion claw its way to the surface. Jake didn't answer her. He just stared at me, his eyes dark with the kind of fury that comes from humiliation, not pain. "Is it true?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, sharper, stripped of the bravado. "Did you have something to do with that acquisition?" I looked at him then. For the first time since I'd sat down, I met his eyes, and I said nothing. That was all he needed. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound that made my mother flinch. "We need to talk," he said, and stormed out of the dining room, heading toward the old den like he still lived there. Claire hesitated for a heartbeat, torn between following him or staying at the table, but eventually she followed, her heels clicking unevenly across the floor. And just like that, the table was split. My father cleared his throat, muttered something about the weather, and poured himself another glass of bourbon, his hands slightly less steady than they'd been before. My mother still hadn't moved. Grandma June, on the other hand, picked up her fork and resumed eating her mashed potatoes, as though she hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of her family's most sacred holiday. I sat back, taking in the silence, letting it stretch, letting it settle. This wasn't the climax. This was the detonation. The fallout was still coming. When I walked into the den, I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to find. Rage, certainly, maybe a dramatic gesture or two, perhaps even some shattered glass, if Jake had decided to lean into the performative side of his wounded masculinity. But what I found instead was something far quieter, and in its own way, far more satisfying. Jake was standing near the fireplace, not looking at me, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the darkened mantel, like he could find answers there, like maybe, if he focused hard enough, the wood would offer him a version of events that didn't end with his little sister holding the deed to his life's work. He didn't turn when I stepped inside. He didn't tell me to sit or leave or shut the door, which I did anyway, more out of instinct than invitation. The room smelled the same as it had when we were kids. Aged leather, old pipe smoke, a faint undercurrent of lemon polish, but it felt different now, heavier, like something final had settled in the walls and was waiting to be acknowledged. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, waiting. "You think you won," he said at last, still not looking at me, his voice flat and strangely hollow, the tone of a man trying to pretend he hadn't already lost. "You think this makes you better than me." It was a statement, not a question, and for once, I didn't rise to the bait. I just let the silence stretch, let him sit in it, let him wrestle with the pieces. He turned then, finally, and his face was tighter than I'd ever seen it. Not just angry, but confused, betrayed, unmoored in a way that made him look older than I remembered. "Why?" he asked, and that single word carried more weight than every insult he'd ever thrown at me. Why go behind my back like that? Why not just come to me? And there it was, the delusion, the fantasy that this had been a business decision, that if I had just asked nicely, he would have welcomed me into the fold like a benevolent king offering scraps to a beggar. I could have laughed, but I didn't. I didn't even smile. Instead, I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until we were standing just a few feet apart. "Because you would have never taken me seriously," I said, my voice calm, measured, as cold as I could make it. "You never have. Not when I started Bright Nest, not when I pitched my first round, not when I asked you for advice, and you told me to find a husband instead. You made your opinion of me perfectly clear for 20 years, so I made mine clear in the only language you actually understand." He stared at me, and for a moment I thought he might yell, or lash out, or try to spin some version of events that made him the victim, the martyr, the misunderstood older brother who'd only ever wanted to help. But he didn't. He just shook his head, like he still couldn't quite believe it, like the ground beneath him was refusing to cooperate with his sense of gravity. "You bought me out," he said quietly, as though he was only now hearing the words in his own voice. "You really did it." "No," I corrected him, leaning in just slightly, not out of malice, but to make sure he didn't miss a syllable. "I didn't just buy you out, Jake. I took what you built, dissected it piece by piece, and rebuilt it into something better, something cleaner, faster, more efficient. I didn't destroy your company. I rescued it. From you." His eyes narrowed, but the fire wasn't there anymore. Just confusion, just loss. He turned away again, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence was different now, less like a pause and more like an ending. Claire never came into the room. Whether she was eavesdropping on the other side of the door or crying in the bathroom or trying to explain to my mother why she'd chosen to align herself with a sinking ship, I never found out. And I didn't care enough to ask. When I finally left the den, I didn't say goodbye. Jake didn't ask where I was going. It felt strangely like we both understood the finality of that moment without needing to put it into words. Back at the table, things had shifted. My father was nursing his third drink, staring out the window like he was watching a war unfold on the lawn. My mother was cleaning plates that no one had finished, her movements mechanical, like muscle memory was the only thing keeping her grounded. Claire had vanished. Grandma June, though, was exactly where I left her, sitting at the head of the table, hands folded, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decode. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said softly as I passed behind her chair. "You could have called it justice and still kept the peace." I paused, unsure whether to engage or walk away, but then she added, "But I suppose it wouldn't have meant as much, would it?" I looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her eyes that looked a lot like understanding. Maybe not approval, but understanding. I didn't say a word, I just nodded. As I walked out to my car, the evening light stretched long across the driveway, the shadows reaching out like tired limbs trying to hold on to something already gone. I thought about the house, about the ghosts in the hallways, and the stories embedded in the wallpaper, and the voices that used to yell my name in every room, and I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt untethered. Jake would survive. Claire would spin her story. My parents would reframe the narrative in a way that allowed them to remain neutral. The acquisition would make the papers. Nestcore would double in valuation by the next quarter. And yet, as I started the engine, I knew there would always be a question that hung in the space between me and everyone I'd left behind. Did I do it for justice or for revenge? And the truth was, co-op, and I wasn't sure anymore.